The closed season had lasted over 8 months, a period during which many changes took place in the world of motor racing. There had been a World Championship race back in January in Argentina, and the Van Wall team, who couldn't afford to travel all that way, released Sterling Moss to drive Rob Walker's little Cooper there. He won, ahead of Musso and Hawthorne in Ferraris, and Fangio, Berra and Schell in Maseratis. So a rear-engine car had won a Grand Prix for the first time since the days of Auto Union before the war. Rob Walker had become the first private entrant to win a World Championship race, and Sterling Moss led the World Championship. There was a new rule preventing drivers from switching cars during a race. Race distances had been reduced from 500 kilometers to 300, and most important of all, alcohol-based fuels had been banned in favor of avgas, the high-octane aeroplane fuel. Van Wall's drivers would be the same as they had been for that famous win at Monza last year: Moss, Brooks and Lewis Evans. They had fitted the now traditional truncated noses, the better to cope with Monaco's notorious traffic jams, and some new magnesium alloy wheels. But they'd experienced difficulty converting the engine to run on petrol, and there was a question mark over Van Wall's reliability. Although the Maserati Works team was gone, there were no less than 6 private 250Fs on the entry list, which contained a total of 29 cars fighting for just 16 places on the grid. There were Works Maserati mechanics on hand to look after the customers' cars. Louis Chiron, the veteran French ace, who won here for Bugatti in 1931, was on hand with his usual well-illustrated advice. The rules may have changed, but the round-the-houses circuit of 1.9 miles, viewed from above the gasworks hairpin, had changed not one jot. The third practice session was from 3 until 4:30, and I joined the Walker pit. Rob had entered 2 Coopers. Ron Flockhart, who had been released by BRM as they only had 2 available cars for their 3 drivers, would handle the Argentine winning car. And then there was a brand new car for Maurice Trintignant with ZF gearbox and Alf Francis designed coil spring rear suspension. Brooks had been fastest in the previous sessions, and sensationally, because of delays and a rain shower in the latter half of Friday's practice, Sterling Moss had yet to qualify. The BRMs were running well, and Berra, new to the team having moved from Maserati, had been as quick as Brooks in the first session. Brooks held on to pole position in Van Wall number 30, with Berra a second slower, but still on the middle of the front row. Ferrari had now forsaken their old Lancia design and had the new 246 with a V6 Dino engine. Their 4 drivers, Von Trips in car 40, Hawthorne in 38, Collins in 36, and Musso in 34. The fastest of them was Hawthorne, but he was still only on the 3rd row of the grid. With no Works Maserati team to drive for, world champion Fangio had gone off to Indianapolis for the month, and somehow without him, the private 250Fs looked slow and distinctly old-fashioned. In the event, only 2 would qualify, Scarlatti and Bonnier, 14th and 16th fastest of the 16 qualifiers. Roy Salvadori qualified 4th fastest in the Works Cooper. His teammate Jack Brabham was 3rd fastest with the other Works car. Its Climax engine, newly stretched to 2.2 litres, had been collected by John Cooper from Nice Airport and carried back to the circuit on the rear seat of a Citroën de Chevaux. Team Lotus were now a proper Grand Prix racing team and had 2 of their front-engine Mark 12 cars, number 26 for Graham Hill and 24 for Cliff Allison. Both had 2-litre Climax engines and both would qualify. Finally, Moss got a good time in his Van Wall, 1 minute 42.3, which may only have been 8th quickest, but at least he was in the race. Tony Vanderbilt could breathe again. And as I looked at the grid sheet, I realized that the revolution has indeed arrived. There are 7 British cars in the top 8. Favourite Ferrari were only 6th, 9th and 10th fastest. The front row on the morrow would be Brooks Vanwell, Bearer BRM and Brabham Cooper. On the second row, the Works 2-litre Cooper of Roy Salvadori and the private Rob Walker car in the hands of Maurice Trenchard. Then came Hawthorne's Ferrari, alongside the other 2 Vanwells of Moss and Lewis Evans, and behind them the rest of Scuderia Ferrari, Collins, Musso and Von Trips. Then came Harry Schell, disappointingly slow in the second BRM, and Allison's Lotus. Scarlatti would line up alongside Hill in the second Lotus, and all alone at the back would be Joe Bonnier in a second private Maserati. 10 British cars, 4 Ferraris, 2 Maseratis. How times are changing. Notable amongst the non-qualifiers were the 2 Connaughts, now bought from the defunct Connaught factory by a certain Mr. Bernie Eccleston, and driven by Paul Emery and Bruce Kessler. Although Ron Flockhart had failed to qualify his second car, Rob and Betty Walker were looking calm as the start time approached. The little Cooper, to be driven by Maurice Trintignant, was to start from the second row. The BRM team, with their 2 drivers, Jean Bérin, who would start from the middle of the front row, and Harry Schell, disappointingly, from somewhere near the back. The fancied Ferrari team, with their new 246 Dinos, had not impressed in practice. Quickest had been Mike Hawthorne, the Farnham Flyer, as he's known, in car number 38, but 5 British cars had set quicker times. Hawthorne would be supported by his teammate Peter Collins, the new German promise Taffy Von Trips, and Roman heartthrob Luigi Musso. The Vanwell team had had mixed fortunes in practice. Brooks had been brilliant to take pole position, but it had taken until the dying moments of the third session for Moss to actually qualify. He and Lewis Evans were on the third row with Hawthorne. Maserati, having withdrawn as a works team, were looking after 2 250Fs for Scarlatti and Bonnier, neither of whom were exactly setting the track alight. Ex-Maserati driver Roy Salvadori was now with Cooper. And Betty Walker was after favours from Signor Musso. The weather was wonderful, and Count Johnny Lureni was one of many motor racing celebrities present. John Cooper was delighted to have 3 of his, quotes, comic little cars in the top 5. The works cars to be driven by Australian Jack Brabham and Roy Salvadori. New regulations imposing shorter race distances had encouraged new teams into Formula One. Lotus was one of them, building lighter and smaller cars, but still with the engine in front. The man behind Lotus, Colin Chapman, and his wife Hazel, were there to watch over their drivers, Graham Hill and Cliff Allison. Le Pétoulet, the diminutive Frenchman, Maurice Trintignant, was with Le Patron, Rob Walker, ready for action. At the appropriate hour, Prince Rainier and Princess Grace rolled along in 2 tons of American chrome to open the course. The grid assembled a sea of dark green, and with 11 English speakers amongst the field, it was to be hoped that the clerk of the course would not conduct the driver's briefing in French. Not much hope of that. Two minutes to go, and Bearer's BRM was push-started. The 16th Grand Prix of Monaco was about to begin. On lap 1, and out of my sight sadly, all manner of mayhem took place at the gasworks hairpin, sparked off apparently by Salvadori's attempt to go straight on towards Nice. When they reappeared along the harbour front, Bera still led from Brooks, Moss, Brabham, Trintignant, Lewis Evans, Hawthorne, Musso, Schell and Von Trips. Salvadori's aborted trip to Nice necessitated adjustments to the Cooper's steering geometry. Trintignant, Lewis Evans, Hawthorne, Musso, Schell and Bera swept past us at the end of lap 2, and only Hawthorne had made any impression on the Green Express ahead of him. Work on the Salvadori Cooper went on, but valuable time slipping away, as Hawthorne overtook Moss and moved up to third. Salvadori rejoined well down the field. The situation up front was unchanged, but behind, Lewis Evans had retired his Van Worn already with defective front brakes. Hawthorne had now got ahead of Brooks to take second place and set about whittling down Bera's lead. But Musso could do little about the Coopers ahead of him. The Walker pit signalled that Trintignant was maintaining his distance behind the Ferrari. Hawthorne pursued the BRM, apparently with a new fire in his belly. The order then at 20 laps read Bera, 4 seconds ahead of Hawthorne. In third, Moss, and then Brooks, whose Van Worn was in trouble, pushed down to fifth soon by Trintignant. At the back of the field came the Lotuses, Maseratis, and Salvadori's recovering Cooper. Bera's lead now looked vulnerable, as the BRM started to hatch gremlins in the braking department. Trintignant's Cooper, on the other hand, was running like a train, and at that, a Swiss one, not a British one. Bera caught the tail enders, with Hawthorne now snapping at his heels. Hawthorne always insisted on an aero screen, in preference to the modern plexiglass wraparound affair. Bera then had to stop to have his brakes looked at, and Moss began to apply pressure on the new leader, Hawthorne, with Trintignant only yards behind and ready to pounce. And next time round, Moss was ahead. Vera rejoined, but it was all in vain. The BRM's brakes were finished. Moss still led, just, from Hawthorne and Trentignan. Harry Schell was now the BRM hope. He was 7th behind the Ferraris of Collins and von Trips. Moss, in the sole surviving Vanwall, tried to pull away from Hawthorne's Ferrari, but the effort was in vain. A few laps on, and Moss was back in the pits, his Vanwall down to 3 cylinders. The mechanics diagnosed a broken cam follower, and the Vanwall promise had evaporated to nothing. This let Hawthorne back into the lead, ahead of the ever-consistent little Cooper of Trentignan. 3 more Ferraris chased Maurice, Musso, Collins and von Trips, in that order. The race was hardly 1/3 run, and plenty of time for the Italian team to see off this small interloper. It looked like being a Ferrari benefit after all. Bera's BRM lay abandoned, along with much of the rest of that field of green which had started this race with such hope. Then at just over half distance, Hawthorne's run ended. The drive to his fuel pump had failed, and astonishingly, the little private Rob Walker Cooper, driven by Maurice Trentignan, was in the lead. Surely it would only be a matter of time before he was overhauled by the chasing pack of Ferraris. Musso was 42 seconds behind, but with 40 laps, he could easily make up the deficit. A file of abandoned Vanwalls filled the pit road as the oldest man in the race, the 41-year-old viniculturist from Vergès, maintained his advantage over the machines from Modena. Further back in the field, Salvadori was still last, many laps behind, and Schell 9th, 7 laps behind after troubles in his surviving BRM. Musso leads one of the Lotuses through to back. Hill and Allison were now 6th and 8th. Chapman's debut was going well, but then Hill's engine seized. The Walker pit worked on in a trance. Le Pétoulet still had 41 seconds lead with 25 laps to go. Could he hold on? Would the car break? His nickname, incidentally, means rat droppings, a reference to the contents of his beloved Bugatti's fuel tank, after it had spent the war years hidden away from the Nazis in a barn. Sterling now appeared in the pits to give encouragement. With 10 laps to go, Musso had whittled the lead down to 26 seconds, but Trentignan was driving well within himself. Hawthorne was back, having, it is said, received more than just a glass of water from a charming young lady on climbing through a window seeking refreshment as he walked back from Casino Square. Salvadori had finally retired. Bonnier had crashed his Maserati over the curb at the Hotel de Paris. And then Trips coasted into the Ferrari pit with a seized motor. There were now just 6 runners left. Trentignan, Musso, Collins, Jack Brabham in 4th, 6 laps ahead of Harry Schell's BRM, and Allison's surviving Lotus. Musso was now less than 30 seconds behind, and so Rob Walker put out the order for Trentignan to speed up. Maurice responded with a near record lap, and the gap opened up again to 31 seconds. That'll show him, said Rob. Then at last it was all over. Trintignant crossed the line, the winner. The little Frenchman had driven the greatest race of his long career. Team Walker had achieved the undreamt of and won 2 World Championship races in succession. Cooper were leading the new Constructors' Cup, and Ferrari's one consolation, Musso, had taken the lead in the Drivers' Championship.